The evening sun had begun its slow descent, casting long orange streaks across the barren land, when Caleb trudged back toward his modest ranch. The day had been merciless. His boots, cracked and dusty from years of wear, sank into the parched earth with each heavy step. He carried no reward for his labor, just the ache of his muscles and the sting of failure gnawing at him. His small herd had wandered farther than expected, and with no rain in weeks, the creek he relied on had nearly dried up. His ranch was falling apart, his animals lean, and his pockets emptier than ever. Caleb was no stranger to hardship, but the weight of it pressed down on him that day more than usual. As he neared the outskirts of his land, a strange sound caught his ear, something that didn't belong to the familiar calls of birds or the distant bleating of goats. It was low, heavy, and broken, a cry. He stopped, his hand instinctively moving toward the worn rifle slung over his shoulder. Coyotes often prowled at dusk, but this sound carried something human in it, something desperate. He stepped cautiously toward the source, the dry grass crunching beneath his boots. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, for what lay ahead was unlike anything he had ever seen. Two enormous figures were sprawled in the dust near the edge of the gulch. They were women, though their sheer size made them appear almost unreal, taller and broader even in their prone state than most men he had ever encountered. Their long black hair clung to their faces and shoulders, matted with dirt and streaked with blood. Their garments, woven from hides and decorated with faint Apache markings, were torn and smeared with battle stains. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. He had heard stories of the Apache giants whispered in saloons and among traveling traders, tales that many dismissed as legends meant to frighten settlers. Yet here they were, not a tale, but flesh and blood, and gravely wounded. His first instinct was fear. Helping them could mean trouble beyond anything he could imagine. If settlers discovered that he had harbored Apache, they would brand him a traitor, and worse, the Apache themselves might return to punish him for interfering. Yet as he stood frozen, his eyes fell on the nearest woman's arm, a jagged wound bleeding freely, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. The other stirred weakly, her face contorted in pain, and a faint groan escaped her lips. They were dying. Caleb felt his heart pound against his ribs. He could turn away, leave them there to their fate, and no one would ever know. But the thought of abandoning another human being to the vultures and coyotes twisted his stomach with shame. He had lost too much in life already: a family, fortune, and comfort. Compassion was all he had left, and even if it ruined him, he could not ignore it. Dropping his rifle to the ground, Caleb hurried forward, his hands trembling as he knelt beside the first sister. Her skin was fevered, her body heavy as stone when he tried to shift her. It took all his strength to drag her inch by inch, his back screaming with the effort. Sweat poured down his brow, soaking into the collar of his worn shirt, but he refused to stop. He pulled her toward the barn, the only shelter he could think of, praying no one would ride past and see. When he returned for the second sister, she was barely conscious, her dark eyes fluttering open long enough to catch a glimpse of him. For a moment, she seemed ready to resist, but her strength failed, and she slumped into his grasp. Caleb gritted his teeth, heaving her up as best he could, staggering under her weight until at last he laid her beside her Keen in the dim light of the barn. The air was thick with hay and the soft rustling of his few remaining animals, but for Caleb, the silence of the place felt like sanctuary. He covered them both with blankets, his hands shaking, and lit a single lantern. Looking at the two giant sisters lying battered and broken on the straw, he knew his life had just taken a turn from which there could be no return. Caleb did not sleep that night. The dim glow of the lantern flickered in the corners of the barn, casting long shadows across the straw and wooden beams. He moved quietly, tending to the two women who lay still, their immense frames dwarfing the cotton blankets he had managed to arrange for them. Every so often one of them would stir, letting out a low groan that echoed like the rumble of distant thunder. He worked with a mix of fear and determination, cleaning their wounds with water from his small barrel, wrapping torn flesh with strips of linen cut from his own shirts, and crushing herbs he had gathered long ago for his own fevers. The scent of sage and blood mixed heavily in the air. He knew little of medicine, but he worked with the steady hands of someone who had no choice but to try. The first sister's injuries were severe. A gash across her arm bled stubbornly, staining the cloth faster than he could bind it. She had deep bruises on her ribs, as though she had been struck by a club or trampled under hooves. The second had a swollen ankle twisted unnaturally, her breaths short and raspy. Caleb whispered to them, though he doubted they understood, words of comfort he had once used for his younger brother when sickness kept him shivering through the night. He spoke softly, not for their ears alone but for his own courage, reminding himself that he had done the right thing, even as a knot of dread tightened in his chest. Hours passed. The rancher's meager supplies dwindled as he poured the last of his water into a tin cup and coaxed the weaker sister to drink. Her eyes fluttered open, and for the first time, he saw the depth and aim, a dark, piercing, but softened with exhaustion. She studied him with suspicion, her gaze sharp even in weakness, and when her cracked lips parted, words came out in a tongue he did not understand. Her voice was low, commanding despite her fragile state. Caleb shook his head slowly, pointing to her wounds, mimicking the action of bandaging himself to show her what he was doing. She frowned, watching his hands carefully, then let her head sink back with a faint nod. The second sister stirred soon after, her size more imposing though she, too, was weakened. When she pushed herself up with surprising strength, Caleb stepped back instinctively, his hand twitching toward the rifle propped against the barn wall, but she did not strike. She looked at her sister first, then at him, her expression caught between suspicion and confusion. Caleb gestured toward the food he had placed near them, half a loaf of bread, a small strip of dried meat, his own dinner, untouched. They hesitated, as though weighing whether it was safe, before the taller one tore off a piece with her long fingers and passed it to her sibling. For the first time, their attention shifted away from fear of him and toward the simple act of sharing what little he had offered. As the lantern dimmed with the last of its oil, Caleb leaned against the wooden post, exhaustion threatening to drag him under. Yet his mind raced. If anyone from town discovered what he had done, he would be ruined. If Apache warriors came searching and found him with their wounded, they might believe he had caused the harm. But then he looked at them again, their bodies once full of strength now reduced to fragile shadows, and he knew leaving them to die would have been far worse than any punishment that might await. Their size, their presence, and the strangeness of the moment did not strip away the simple truth that they were human beings in need. Just before dawn, when the first pale light crept through the barn slats, the taller sister shifted upright with difficulty, wincing at the pain in her side. She looked at Caleb for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then inclined her head slightly, a gesture of gratitude. It was small, but it carried a weight he felt deep in his chest. He exhaled slowly, realizing that whatever trust had begun to spark between them was fragile but real. And in that fragile trust, he sensed that his quiet, struggling life was about to change forever. By the time the sun climbed high overhead, Caleb could feel unease crawling through the air like heat waves. The sisters were stronger than the night before, though still far from healed. They had insisted on rising, their immense figures awkward within the confines of his barn, ducking beneath beams that barely cleared their heads. Caleb tried to persuade them to rest, but they ignored him, exchanging words in their own tongue, their voices carrying a rhythm both sharp and melodic. He didn't understand the language, but the urgency in their tone left no room for doubt. They knew something was coming, and soon. It began with a faint tremor beneath the earth. Caleb was outside, gathering wood for the stove, when he felt it, a vibration, subtle at first, then growing heavier with each second until the rattling of hooves filled the distance. His heart sank. Riders. He turned toward the horizon, where a plume of dust rose like a storm cloud. The sisters stepped out of the barn behind him, their towering forms silhouetted against the light, and though they still leaned on each other for support, their presence carried an undeniable strength. Caleb gripped his rifle, torn between fear and resolve. He knew he could not fight the Apache warriors rode with speed and fury unmatched by settlers, but he could not abandon the women either. The riders came fast, their cries carrying on the wind, until they reined in before the ranch. Horses snorted and pawed at the ground, their breath heavy in the heat. Caleb counted a dozen, all armed, their bodies painted for war. At their front sat a man who commanded attention without speaking. The Apache chief dismounted in one smooth motion, his stature not as towering as the sisters but no less formidable. His dark eyes swept across the scene at the ranch, the barn, the two women standing beside a ragged rancher. Caleb felt the weight of that gaze settle on him like a stone, and his palms grew damp around the rifle. The air was thick with silence. The warriors behind the chief gripped their weapons tightly, ready to act at a word. Caleb's pulse hammered in his ears. He thought of running, of raising his gun, of shouting an explanation, but his throat was dry and no words would come. Then, to his astonishment, the two sisters moved forward. Their steps were slow, labored from their injuries, but steady. They raised their hands, palms open, and began to speak rapidly in their language, their voices overlapping as they gestured first to their wounds, then to Caleb, and back again. Their words poured out with urgency, carrying gratitude and insistence. The warriors shifted uneasily in their saddles. Some frowned, others whispered to each other, their eyes flicking between the women and the rancher. Caleb stood motionless, unable to grasp what was being said, but he felt the shift in energy. This was no accusation, no plea for vengeance. It was something else entirely. The chief's face remained unreadable, his gaze fixed on the sisters as they spoke. When they fell silent, he stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the dirt until it touched Caleb's boots. For a long moment, the chief said nothing. The only sound was the restless stamping of horses and the creak of leather saddles. Caleb's heart thudded painfully in his chest, certain that judgment was about to fall upon him. Then the chief turned slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied the sisters once more. He exchanged a few quiet words with them, and they answered with solemn nods. The chief looked back at Caleb, his expression still stern, but softened by something new, our recognition, perhaps, or reluctant respect. Caleb felt the air shift again, heavier, but not with the finality of death. Something was about to be decided, and whatever it was, it would shape his fate in ways he could not yet imagine. The chief stood before Caleb, his presence commanding silence even without lifting his voice. The rancher gripped his rifle tighter, though he knew it would do no good against so many. Dust swirled around their feet, caught in the afternoon heat, while the two sisters stood close enough that Caleb could feel the weight of their shadows stretching across his shoulders. His breath came shallow, his heart hammering as if trying to escape his chest. Then, with slow deliberation, the chief raised his hand. The warriors behind him fell still, their restless shifting quieting instantly. Caleb braced himself, expecting a signal to strike him down. Instead, the chief spoke, his words rough and broken with English, but clear enough to pierce the air. "You save my daughters." The sentence hung there, heavy as an axe. Caleb blinked, unsure he had heard correctly. He turned his gaze toward the sisters, who stood tall despite their wounds. They nodded in unison, their eyes fixed on their father. It was then that Caleb's mind reeled with the realization that these two immense women were not just warriors of their people, but blood of the Apache leader himself, daughters of the chief. His knees nearly buckled as the truth settled in. The warriors murmured behind their chief, some with surprise, others with disapproval. Their voices carried the unease of men unused to seeing an outsider standing so close to the sacred bond of kin. The chief silenced them with a glance. He stepped closer to Caleb, his boots pressing into the dry earth with steady rhythm, until only a few feet separated them. Caleb could smell the smoke of campfires clinging to the man's clothes, the iron scent of leather and horse. The chief placed a hand on his chest, above his heart, then pointed at Caleb with that same hand. "Protection," he said firmly, the word accented but unmistakable. Caleb's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to explain that he had done nothing for reward, that he had only acted because he could not watch someone die. But the words tangled in his mouth. He lowered his rifle slowly, letting it rest against the side of the barn. His eyes flicked toward the sisters, who now looked at him not with suspicion, but with warmth and gratitude. One of them, her arm still wrapped in the cloth he had bound, touched her chest lightly, then extended her hand toward him in a gesture of respect. The chief turned back to his warriors and addressed them in his own tongue, his voice rising with authority. Caleb could not understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, a decree. The warriors, though visibly unsettled, bowed their heads in acceptance. Some cast glances at Caleb, hard and measuring, but none raised their weapons. The chief's decision had been made, and among his people. That was final. For Caleb, the moment felt unreal. Only yesterday, he had been a poor rancher scraping by, his land barely yielding enough to keep him alive. He had feared losing everything to the relentless drought, to debts, to hunger. Now he found himself under the protection of a people both feared and respected across the frontier. His ranch, once vulnerable and forgotten, was suddenly bound to the strength of an entire nation through the unexpected bond of mercy. The chief placed a firm hand on Caleb's shoulder, his grip strong enough to root him in place, yet not hostile. His dark eyes held Caleb's with an intensity that made him feel as though his soul was being weighed. Then, with a single nod, the chief released him and turned back to his horse. The sisters lingered a moment longer, their gazes steady and unflinching. They had been saved by his hands, and through them, his life had been irrevocably changed. Caleb stood motionless as the riders mounted their horses once more, dust rising around them like a shroud, the thunder of hooves carrying them away across the open land. The ranch felt different now, no longer just a patch of earth in the wilderness, but a place bound by a promise sealed under the scorching sun.